You alright folks? Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new, it's nice to have you. Recently, I made a video going over a few things that you can do in your downtime in Wrath of the Lich King, and in that I mentioned the tier 0.5 quests for the unique appearances. And whilst doing it, I realised just how underrated those quests actually are. In fact, the entire chain is bloody brilliant and the perfect example of content that encapsulates what it means to play an MMORPG. Questing, dungeoneering, professions, traversing the world, and just generally having a cracking adventure. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why we never got something like this after Vanilla WoW. So, for those that don't know, Tier 0.5 is the upgraded variant of the Vanilla dungeon sets. So, your Shadowcraft into Dark Mantle, Valor into Heroism, so on and so forth. The basics are you take the blue quality dungeon set and through a series of quests in the open world, going back into dungeons you're otherwise familiar with, using items you've gathered or crafted to tackle unique encounters that you wouldn't be able to access in the standard dungeon group, and just doing all of that ultimately to exchange the dungeon drop item for the upgraded version, in some cases exchanging the rare quality item for an epic one, which back in the day was still a big thing. Why then do I think this quest chain is so great? Why is it, in my opinion, a severely underrated and massively underutilized form of content? Because it's the ultimate side quest with a side quest villain who has no bearing on the overall plot of anything outside of his own contained story. And if we had something like this once or even twice every expansion, I don't see why it wouldn't be a good thing. And this chain is long, make no mistake about it, it's an investment. And that alone makes me love it even more. It's content you won't be done with in 5 minutes. You travel the length and breadth of Azeroth doing all manner of things for actual useful upgrades, at least if you're on a vanilla server, and not just murdering a raid boss hoping for a drop. Although in fairness, there is kind of a degree of that if you're trying to get the original dungeon item. And I know calling it a side quest is a bit of a nebulous term for vanilla because there wasn't really a main story. But it does rather give off those sort of vibes. It's not a raid event, it's dungeon and quest orientated, and while some items would be comparable to gear that drop in later raids, that wasn't the case for every item or every set. And we wouldn't see anything that could be considered a dungeon set after TBC. But even in the Burning Crusade, we didn't get a quest chain for that expansion in the same vein as the Tier 0.5, which is tragic, but it is what it is. So, before we get into the meat of things, let me cast your minds back and give you some context before we get into the actual chain itself. Now, there was this goblin chap in Booty Bay by the name of Gremnik Rizzlesprang. He rather fancied the spellbook of one Lord Valthalak. Not much in the way of lore on either of those, but in the case of Valthalak, he was the reigning general of Blackrock Spire before Drakkisath took charge. The daft git was slain by the Veilblade Mercenary Company who were hired by the aforementioned goblin to nab the aforementioned spell book. And the Veilblade themselves aren't much more than an NPC guild whose members are just a teeny tiny bit screwed, as everyone we deal with in this chain, from the initial quest givers in Ironforge and Orgrimmar down to the poor buggers we have to kill to get the amulets, are ex-members. The reason they're ex-members is because of that age-old issue, loot drama. Now, there was an ogre necromancer who tried to ninja loot Valthalak's amulet. This did not go down too well with his fellow guildies. Alas, it was ultimately split into 3 pieces, and the highest rollers were Theldrin, Isalian, and siblings Gerion and Zothos. Little did these pillocks realise, they just unleashed a curse, and shortly thereafter, the spirit of the recently defeated Valthalak made an appearance and let loose some spectral assassins to get their sweet, sweet revenge. Realising just how screwed they were, they decided to book it out of there as quickly as humanly possible. Unfortunately for More Greyhoof, he wasn't a human, so he tripped and fell into the hellhole that is LBRS. Weirdly, he survived that, and the subsequent torture at the hands of the trolls living down there. But the assassins eventually caught up to him and decided beef was back on the menu. This would rather start a trend of the members of the Veiled Blade winding up dead one way or another, generally in fairly brutal fashions. Once the rest of them got out, the loot drama was too much, so after completing their quest, the GM, Anthony and Harmon, disbanded their guild and everyone went their own way, and for the most part, yeah, met an unfortunate ending. I just think this is fairly neat, to be honest. We've got ourselves a big fuck-off Draconid, used to be in charge of Blackrock Spire, but otherwise wasn't all that important to anything we players would have encountered, and he's now hunting down his murderers via necromancy and other dark magics. It's not a world-ending threat, or even a local threat, really. It's just a dragon bloke who is severely pissed off at a bunch of rampaging loot goblins and wants their heads on a spike for their misdeeds. And I can kind of endorse that kind of revenge, if I'm honest. So, let's get into the chain itself. It starts pretty simply, actually, and there might be the odd very, very, very minor difference between Horde and Alliance, and I'll point those out as best I can if they crop up. But it's the same shebang either way. Which is to go to the respective throne rooms in Orgrimmar and Ironforge. From there, you'll have a chat with either Deliana or Mokvar. If you ever did Siege of Orgrimmar, you might remember pummeling the latter to death during that raid, as he goes on to become the treasurer of the city. If you speak to Deliana, she'll task you to go collect 15 bloods from the beasts in Winterspring. Note they only drop from frost sabers and bears. And Mokvar needs you to go to Silithus for 15 venom samples from the local spiders and scorpions. Once you got those, head back to your respective quest giver with your dungeon set braces and 20 gold in hand, and voila, you've got your first piece of tier 0.5. However, this is simply an illusion.
An illusion? What are you hiding?
The rest of the chain is just not as simple. From here on in, you'll be bouncing around the world as if someone just stuck a lit firework up your ass and you're trying to run away from the fuse. Both quest givers will send you to Tanaris to chat with a goblin called Muck's Mana Scrambler in order to make an extra dimensional ghost revealer. It's a bit of kit you will need to do near enough everything else in this quest chain. Dear old Mux asks you to bring him a few bits and pieces: one delicate Arcanite converter, 4 greater eternal essences, 10 stone scale oil, all of which can be made by players or bought on the auction house, and finally, to go scoop up 25 volcanic ash from the burning steps. Once you've handed those in, he'll whip up an ectoplasmic distiller and ask you to go sweep up a bunch of different ectoplasms from around the world: Silithus, Winterspring, and the Eastern Plaguelands. Once you've gathered all of your ghost goo, you head back to Mux, and he decides he needs you to go back to the Burning Steps, this time to kill Magma Lord Bok and loot a magma core from his beaten corpse. Don't know why he couldn't have told us this when we were there last time, but hey ho, he's a goblin, he makes about as much sense as a drunk Glaswegian. But luckily, the mob is a non-elite, and as such, will fall over in a stiff breeze. Collect this core, and you can head back to Mr. Mana Scrambler. He then says, "Cheers, bud, now fuck off to Winterspring again. You've got to go speak to Viel, that annoying little impy bastard in Dark Whisper Gorge. Go grab a fell elemental rod from him, and then you can return to Mux." Honestly, he should have just given me the entire shopping list, because at this point, I want to turn him into a ghost. But, luckily for Mux, and for your sanity, this is the last component he needs. He whips up that ghost revealer and sends you back to your respective quest giver. They then reward you with the belt and the gloves of your set. On to chapter 3 of this peculiar little saga then. Deliana and Mokvar will send you off to find their old guildmaster, Antheon Harmon. Now this unfortunate undead could be found kicking his heels at the entrance to Stratholme. To be able to see and interact with him, you got to use that Ghostbuster doohickey that you made with Mux. It gives you a 10-minute buff that allows you to commune with spirits. So, who needs to be psychic when you got goblins, am I right? This poor sod met his end whilst trying to rescue his dearly beloved. If you've ever done a Baron run, she's that daft git locked up in his cage that he executes after 45 minutes. So, he tasks you to succeed where he failed. Go and rescue his beau. Easy mode for seasoned zombie murderers like ourselves. You save the damsel, go back to the ghost with proof of his missus still breathing, and he gets on to the really important stuff: building a banner to piss off a dwarf. You'll start by gathering some materials, and by classic standards they're going to be expensive. If you're doing it in Wrath, not so much. But you need 3 dark iron bars, 20 enchanted leather, 4 cured rugged hide, and 3 mooncloth. Yay for having a load of leatherworkers and tailors in my back pocket. Bring all of those things to Antheon and he'll make for you an incomplete banner of provocation. You heard me right, incomplete. Since Antheon is a bit of a crap craftsman these days, he sends us to go bother an elf by the name of Falrin Treeshaper in Dire Maul. Falrin, however, needs some busy work doing. He isn't too fond of ogres, and he wants us to go and gather 25 ogre war beads. These can be gathered from the ogres in Dire Maul itself, or those in Lower Blackrock Spire. It doesn't matter which. When I did it, I just cleared every single ogre I could find in Dire Maul, and I was able to get them all in one lockout, so the drop rate isn't all that bad. After you do this, you go back to Falrin, and he needs a Jeering Spectre's essence from one of the local ghosts in DM. Lots of ghosts in this chain, now I think about it. Apparently being alive is optional to get these upgrades. Alongside that, you'll need 8 large brilliant shards and 4 dark runes. Bring all of that to Falrin and he completes your banner of provocation, and then tasks you to go to Blackrock Depths in order to challenge Theldrin, who was one of the lucky rollers I mentioned earlier, and is in possession of the top piece of Valthalak's amulet. In his time since the disbanding of the Veil Blade, he set up his own arena team and spends his days battering combatants in the Ring of Law. Once you make it to BRD, you go into the Ring of Law, and to fight Theldrin, you need to drop the banner when High Justice Grimstone is busy prattling on about how you will die. So drop it pretty much as he spawns so that he summons the boss you need, and not one of the army of random spawns this encounter can usually throw at you. After Theldrin has been unceremoniously beaten to a pulp, you can loot the amulet and plunder the ill-gotten gains of him and his pals. Once you've gotten this piece of the Valthalak puzzle, you head back to Antheon, who will then send you to your respective faction capital, and for heroic deeds, you shall receive the pants, shoulders, and boots. For the last leg, we are tasked to go and find Bodley, another ghost, this time chilling outside the entrance to Blackrock Spire. You've got to use that ghost revealer again to find this fine fellow. Well, I say fine fellow, he's a gnome, so perhaps fine garden ornament might be more apt. Either way, the first quest you'll get from Bodley is to go and gather 4 items. Firstly, a hallowed brazier from the Argent Dawn. This requires a minimum of honoured with that faction and a chunk of gold, and then 3 things from 3 specific fire elementals. Well, 2 elementals and 1 snake thing. The Incendite from Incendius and the Ember from Emberseer are pretty simple to get your hands on. Both are bosses in BRD and UBRS respectively, so you just go in, kill them, get your item, and away you go. The third, though, is a little bit more tricksy. It's worth noting you need to be friendly with the Cenarian Circle, just do a couple of quests in Silithus and you'll be set. But once that is done, you will then need to acquire a cinder from a Duke of Cinders. If you have 0 idea what a Duke of Cinders is, I don't blame you. I too avoid Silithus like the plague. But it's this. Anyway, you know all those Twilight fellows in the zone? Well, you need to kill them until you get your hands on a full set of the Twilight Cultist gear they drop. In theory, you only need 4 of those sets, but I'll get into why you may need a little more later on. You need these sets to summon elites in the area via the lesser windstones in the encampments, and the sets then get used up when you summon said elites. These elementals will then drop abyssal crests. You gather 3 of these, and in conjunction with 1 large brilliant shard, you hand them in to 1 oral gold leaf in the Cenarian Hold, and she will then present you with a Medallion of Station. You use this with your 4th and, in theory, final cultist set on a windstone. Not lesser, not greater, just a plain old windstone. And here's where things get a little bit RNG, as this is where you, in theory, summon the Duke of Cinders. However, unless you have a Signet of Beckoning Fire, spawning the mob you need is not guaranteed, and you could end up with one of the other 3 elements. I got relatively lucky and got the spawn on my second go through it, so it didn't take me all that long, but the odds may screw with you. Hence why I said earlier, you in theory only need 4 of the Twilight sets, but it could be a lot more. Luckily, the drop rates are mental, so it shouldn't take you too long. So, the Signet of Beckoning I mentioned, you may wonder why not just go for it? It'll guarantee the spawn you need. Because depending on the era in which you do this, and in fairness, in both of them, it might just be faster to brute force it and just see what you get. To acquire the Signet, you need a scroll that will allow you, with the addition of 1 Dark Rune and 5 Fire Bloom, make the Signet. But to get the scroll, you need to complete some quests for a guy called Hermit Ortel, who is in a cave east of Hyde Regal in Silithus. To get to that point, you need to go through a small chain that starts in Cenarian Hold, and to actually get your hands on the scroll itself, you need to wait several hours after completing the required quest for Ortel to send you a care package in the mail, and the scroll you need is not even guaranteed in said care package. They can also be sold on the auction house as well, so on a vanilla era server you might actually find a wide selection available on the open market. In Wrath, however, there was only a single scroll and it was the wrong one. And on the subject of the auction house, the Abyssal Crests can be bought and sold there too. Again, price may vary. In Wrath they were going for 75 gold a pop, which by Wrath numbers isn't much, but I'm a tight ass and I would rather go murder some local nutbags to get the items instead of forking out the gold. So yeah, in the time it takes to get the scroll that guarantees the mob you need, you could just go zug-zug on the mobs and brute force it until you get the spawn. It's a 25% chance anyway, so it shouldn't take you too many. If you are on a vanilla era server, however, and playing a class or spec that doesn't hold its own all that well, you might find it easier to wait until you get the scroll via the drop or from the auction house, and then wrangle a few pals to kick the spear out of the mob once, instead of spending potentially quite a long while doing this process over and over and over. But once you've killed the Duke and gotten the Cinder from him, you can go back to Bodley and Blackrock Mountain and hand in all of the materials you've gathered thus far. Once you do that, a bit of randomness again. He can present you with one of 4 quests that can send you to the 4 corners of the map. Whilst random, it doesn't actually have an overall effect on the chain itself. It's just a bit of flavour, and there's no 2 paths that are guaranteed to be identical from this point forward. Even for characters of the same class and spec. And they for sure can be, but that's just the dice rolling that way and not intentional by any means. But whatever quest you do get does dictate what dungeon you will go to after, and what boss you will kill to get the next piece of the amulet. Again, just flavour and variety. So, firstly, you can be sent to Winterspring to kill the elite giants in the south to collect a Starbreeze village relic. Getting this quest will result in you going to Dire Maul to defeat Isalian. You could then be sent to Silithus to kill the elite Silithid in Hyde Regal to collect druidic remains. Getting this quest means you go to LBRS to defeat more Greyhoof. You could also be sent to Purgation Isle off the coast of Hillsborough to kill some elite undead to collect soul ashes of the banished. This will result in you going to Scholarmance to defeat Cormac. And finally, you can go to the Eastern Plaguelands to kill elite Scarlet Crusaders to collect a brilliant Sword of Zealotry. If you get this quest, you'll be sent to Strat Live to defeat Geryon and Sothos. After completing one of these quests and their dungeon follow-up, you will pluck the left piece of Valthalak's amulet from your respective spook's beaten and bloodied corpse. And with that, we're left with one final piece of the puzzle before we face off against the big man himself. The right piece of the amulet. Bodley sends us to Alcaz Isle, a dangerous place and a fairly underutilised location in WoW. He wants you to gather 20 blood kelp from the elite Naga slithering about the place. The drop rate is pretty high, but not guaranteed, and sometimes you can get multiple drops a kill, and there are a few baskets lying around that you can loot to get a few from as well. Pretty simple, but again, depending on the era you're in, this stage could either be a quick and easy murder fest, or you're going to need to wrangle a bunch of your mates to get it done. You gather your blood kelp, head back to Bodley, and he does some magical hoodoo to divine what to do next. Now, this part isn't actually all that unique. It's identical to the earlier step with the random quest. Bodley will send you off on the same kind of goose chase, and this is admittedly probably the least interesting part of the chain, as it is just a copy and paste of what you did earlier. Again, it's random and pulled from the pool of quests you didn't get the first time. So if you got Geryon and Sothos for the left part of the amulet, you will get one of the other three for the right part. It's a bit rinse and repeat until the right part of the amulet has been obtained. You do the quest to kill the elites in the open world. You get the item, go back to Bodley, go to the dungeon, kill the boss, get the amulet. Job's a good 'un. But you now have a completed amulet. Huzzah! But before you go and use it to take on Lord Valthalak, Bodley has one more quest for you to do. He wants a flask of supreme power. As is the theme for this chain, on a vanilla-era server, that is probably a hefty investment. Wrath less so. And he also wants 40 Blackrock bracers from the orcs inside Blackrock Spire. When I did this, I cleaned out the lower and upper sections of the instance, and it took me just before the Beast's Room to get the final one, so you will be killing a lot of orcs. Hand in that quest, and you've made it. The final showdown, the last hurrah, the big bust-up. You go back into UBRS, clear out the Beast's Room, and drop the Brazier of Beckoning, forged from components you gathered earlier in the centre of the room, and then Lord Valthalak appears. Now, I actually fought this guy in Classic. Never did the chain myself, but I did join a couple of UBRS groups that were doing him, and holy hell, he's a bastard. He is one tough encounter, particularly for a smaller sized raid, and frankly, for all the work you've put into up to this point, he should be. It would be disappointing to get this far and for him to be a pushover. He can and will wipe groups that are unprepared, and although he isn't in any way significant to lore beyond this chain and this story, I can believe a powerful Draconid spellcaster being able to turn a 10-man raid inside out. And yeah, he's a decent final hurdle to this whole chain. Even in Wrath, when I did the whole thing, I heard and read that he can still savage level 80s who aren't prepared, and occasionally I do actually see groups crop up in LFG with people needing a few extra heads for him. When I went in, I was expecting to get rinsed in all honesty, but I didn't have any issues at all on my rogue. He's decently geared and can handle himself. Perhaps for a lesser geared individual playing a class or spec that isn't a nasty bastard rogue, might have difficulties, but who knows? But once you take him down, the hard work is over. You use the complete amulet on his corpse and you summon his spirit, which you then talk to hand in the quest. Now, he does rather threaten to end your measly existence then and there, but for reuniting his spirit with his body, he decides that you get to keep your worthless life, at least for now. He then gives you a simple follow-up quest to go back to Bodley, who will give you a Brazier of Invocation. With this item, you can go back and summon any of the bosses in this chain at any time, as it is a permanent bit of kit. Even for bosses you didn't have a quest to go and fight, which is always neat, as some of them have pretty wicked items, particularly more Greyhoof. He has a relic, which is just the dog's bollocks for druids throughout the entirety of vanilla. After you've gotten your Brazier from Bodley, he sends you back to your respective faction representative in Ironforge or Orgrimmar, and with that, you get your final pieces of the set. Your helmet and your chest. And that's that. You have your 0.5 set. For some classes, some of the items are incredibly powerful and will rival raid gear if you're playing on a vanilla server, which is huge in and of itself. But looking back on how this quest was designed and the rewards for completing it, it's obvious its purpose is to give people, or alts that maybe don't raid, some upgrades and reward them for playing the game in a way that doesn't revolve around doing the, at the time, hardest content with the raids, but still gives them a goal to work towards and a reason to log in. And that's something WoW really has lost as the expansions went on. rewarding content outside of raids or high-end PvP. Yes, in a lot of cases these items aren't the greatest, and for a lot of the pieces they will be replaced by raid gear, but that's not a bad thing either. If someone doesn't have the time to raid, but wants to progress their character at max level, being given this pretty sizable quest chain that makes you feel like you're playing a fun and engaging MMO, whilst giving you rewards that in theory should be decently relevant to your character, is a great form of progression. And I just wish we had more stuff like this in the game. And I would hope that if we ever get Classic Plus, they take the 0.5 chain and use it as a blueprint for future content. Because yes, it will take time. It is an investment both in time and money, both of which are things that you should be investing in your character anyway. And apart from the repeat of a quest at the end and the back and forth in some of the areas of the chain, I can't really fault it. Both are products of their time, but do lend to the overall feel of an adventure. And I'm not going to judge a quest chain designed and implemented in vanilla by modern standards too much, because it was still a great experience. What also helps is the fact that, for the most part, the sets are visually distinct from their original counterparts. And for some classes, like the Rogue, the recolor beats the original by a country mile, and is something that you will enjoy showing off, and if someone sees it, they'll know you put the effort in to get it. Outside of the base item and the whole thing with Duke of Cinders, which wasn't really a big deal, there was no real luck involved, just time and dedication to improving your character and your gear beyond just the odd enchant, which I really like, and I think is a massively underutilized approach to endgame character progression. And as I mentioned earlier, it just feels like the ultimate side quest. You don't need to do this chain. Even by the time it came out in Classic 2019, there wasn't too much incentive for most classes, which was a shame. But if, as I said, you are someone who doesn't raid, or it's an alt that doesn't see much in-game content, it's a brilliant time investment and will allow you to keep moving forward and playing the game past leveling for quite a while. Or hell, if you're like me and just want the set for looks, it's still worth doing. I know Wrath servers, the difficulty wasn't all there, but it was still fun experiencing a quest chain I've always ignored because the classes I've played have had no real use for the items. But even with that said, I wish we had more content like this in the game, classic and retail alike, where I can get an item in a dungeon, and not just some random stat stick of an item, but a visually appealing, flavorful bit of kit, much like the original dungeon sets, and through hard work, dedication, time investment, and good old-fashioned adventure, I can improve those items, making myself more powerful, and due to the nature of the beast, have a fun time. And I know not everyone is going to tackle the chain, so having the full set of 0.5 is a badge of honour in and of itself. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have this kind of content out there for those that want to partake in it. I will always be in favour of endgame content outside of raids that is A, rewarding. Those rewards don't necessarily need to compete with raiding. My opinion has always been raiding should be the pinnacle, and that's where you get the really impressive shit, but rewarding nevertheless. Again, for a player that doesn't raid, having access to a class set that isn't as overpowered as the current raid tier is still a good thing. You will get some class flavour, some tier bonuses, but ultimately Dragonstalker will be more powerful than Beastmaster, and that's the way it should be. And B, it's challenging. Again, I know I did this in Wrath, so it's not really the hardest thing, but raiding shouldn't be the only form of content that can give you a bit of jip as you progress, which is something this quest chain encapsulates nicely for a level 60. And the whole time, I felt like I was on an adventure. I wasn't some great saviour of the universe, slaying gods and titans. Just a murder hobo looking for some more shinies, really. And that's one of those things that WoW needs to recapture. Adventure. Doing things that don't impact the overall big kerfuffle of the moment. Just sharpen your swords, dust off your spellbook, gather your pals, and away you go. You're not going to be hailed as some conquering hero at the end of this, and you don't need to be. You travelled to the far corners, delved into the deepest, darkest dungeons of the land, communed with ghosts, fought battalions of orcs and ogres, and battled a draconid noble. Like, hell, if you wrote a book about this shit, I'd read it. And that's what we should be getting in endgame quest chains. There are other little things that happen as well throughout the entire chain that I love, but I just didn't mention them going through it. Like, every so often when you hand in a quest, you'll get a bunch of spectral assassins appear to try and murk you, which just amuses me. But also, if you haven't done the reading or been paying much attention to the quests themselves, it's really rather a what in the actual fuck moment when you get swarmed by a handful of black-robed bald blokes with horns. It makes you wonder where in the hell they came from and what they're doing here. It's just kind of cool, and I like cool. WoW needs to be cool. And the fact that most of the lore around this chain is just for this chain, the bad guys, the Veiled Blade, etc., etc., whilst they could have been recycled, and one day they might be, it's nice that they so far haven't been. Like, it goes back to what I said about being a side quest. Not everything need interweave and be part of a bigger, grander story. Sometimes a smaller scale kerfuffle is what's needed for a good time. But if you find yourself with some time to kill, be that on an era server or in Wrath, and you want to try something new, give the quest chain a go. You won't regret it. You'll experience a unique and contained story that wraps itself up nicely. You might get some upgrades, you might not, but at the very least you'll get a shiny class set to hang on your wall. Anyway, that's me and why I think this chain is massively underrated. Let me know your own thoughts down below. If you'd be so kind as to like, sub, share your pals and so on, that'd be grand and I'd really appreciate it. Have a good one, folks. Bye for now.